Hello. On behalf of the PATH Foundation, which is dedicated to strengthening health, wellness, and human development in Virginia's Fauquier, Rappahannock, and northern Culpeper counties, I'd like to welcome you to a community conversation about racism and implicit bias. My name is Gene Gibbons. I'm a retired newsman. With me are two distinguished Americans, Dr. Clarence B. Jones, Director of the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco, and Mr. Wes Moore, CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, one of the largest anti-poverty organizations in the United States. Dr. Jones is a longtime leader of the U.S. civil rights movement. He was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s personal lawyer, speechwriter, strategic advisor, and friend from 1960 until Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. He's been a leader for racial justice and equality in the decades since. Mr. Wes Moore, in addition to being CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, is a best-selling author. In fact, he has a new book out just this week. The title is 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City. We're going to be talking about that a little later on. Gentlemen, it's an honor to be with the two of you this evening. These past few months have been catastrophic ones for our country. We're in the midst of a deadly pandemic that has killed more than 120,000 of our fellow citizens, a disproportionate number of them Black Americans. If that weren't bad enough, we've had yet another cascade of police killings of Black Americans, culminating with the videotaped slow motion death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis. That has sparked a wave of demonstrations and protests throughout the country, a collective moral uprising, as you, Dr. Jones, has put it, and a lot of soul searching among us white Americans. We've seen outcries against racism time and time again over the years. This time, it seems to me somewhat different. The demonstrations have been much more widespread. There seems to be much greater white participation. And there seems to be a growing recognition among white Americans that racism is every bit as pervasive and deadly as the pandemic that we're in the midst of. Is that how you see it, Dr. Jones? Are you encouraged by what's going on?
Oh, well, yes, I am. I'm encouraged, but the dialectic is I'm encouraged and discouraged. I'm encouraged by seeing so many white people who have joined with Black people who are opposed to seeing our young men being killed by police. And so, I'm encouraged to see a large number of people outside the Black community who are concerned about that. I'm discouraged the fact that this still remains, this being the whole question of the full acceptance of African Americans as part of our body politic, seems to still be an unfinished and unresolved issue. And then it's further complicated with some confusion that is sometimes spiked by the media and sometimes spiked by our national government in terms of the dispute has been around certain statutes, certain symbols in our country. From a political standpoint, to me, what I see, and it's what I call in my writings and my teaching, the resumption of unfinished reconstruction. That's what we're saying about.
Mr. Moore, you're a younger generation than Dr. Jones and myself, how do you see what's going on?
So first, I sit in awe of listening to Dr. Jones tell his stories and give his perspective, because I know that so much of where we are is because of the progress that Dr. Jones and so many of you also forged for us. And so I offer a very sincere and a very humbled thank you for that. And I offer a very sincere and a very humbled commitment that we will continue to push farther and faster and further. It's because of the foundation that you all laid, and it's because it's what you demand. And you bring up a really important point about this year, about the complication of this year, because, 2020 has thrown two genuine crises at our doorstep. The first was the introduction of a virus that has had catastrophic health and economic implications in our society that we will be dealing with and facing for years to come. And the other was the very unneeded reminder of how inequitable policing is in different communities. But the reality about both these two crises that we see is that despite the fact that they are very different beasts, they expose the very same truth. And when I say that, what I mean is while COVID-19 impacted everybody, it did not impact everybody the same, because people of color contracted COVID at twice the rate. People of color also died at twice the rate. Police reform is necessary for all communities. But the reality is that we watched George Floyd on camera take his last breaths while handcuffed on the ground, while a grown man nonchalantly pressed his knee into his neck until he could no longer breathe. And we watched how his name now gets added to a long lineage of others, from Michael Brown to Philando Castile to Freddie Gray to Walter Scott to Sean Bell to Eric Gardner to Sandra Bland to Breonna Taylor to Laquan McDonald to Tamir Rice to Ahmaud Arbery to Trayvon Martin. And the list goes on. But these twin crises, they do expose that singular truth, and that is the role that race plays in all of our work. The fact is that when we're looking at race, it's one of the most reliable predictors of life outcomes across several areas, and all the data goes and reinforces that. And that includes life expectancy, that includes academic achievement, that includes income, and includes wealth, physical and mental health, maternal mortality. And so the thing that I see right now, and the thing that does give me a real sense of hope for right now, is I think the push for progress is not going to simply be about how can we make adjustments on whether or not there's the authorization to put in together chokeholds or no-knock warrants. This is bigger than that. And what is being protested right now is bigger than just simply making adjustment to the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. This is about, are we as a nation willing to tackle not just one of the trickiest issues that we have in our society, but frankly, the trickiest issue we have in our society. And that issue is the role that race plays in every single dynamic and dimension that we have and that we live in and exist in this country.
Dr. Jones, you said that you were encouraged by the participation, discouraged the fact that here we are 57 years after Dr. King spoke at the Lincoln Memorial, and the same problems exist still. If there is recognition among us white Americans that we really have to do something about it, finally, at long last, how do we sustain the energy? How do we keep what we're seeing right now going next month and in August and in January of next year to keep people's feet to the fire on finally dealing with this deadly problem?
You see, what the pandemic virus and the police shootings and killings that my colleague Wes Moore recited is that they're just they're symbols. They're the tips of the iceberg of a more fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that America still wrestled with this beast, this octopus that strangled it for years, and that is the legacy of slavery and its companion ideology of white supremacy. The historical consequences of the institution of slavery and its pernicious supporting rationale of white supremacy, that has been something that has dominated our country since the Civil War. That's what the Civil War was about, the question of whether the country was going to be committed to the continuation of slavery or free. And the dispute around the statutes is really a question is whether the country wants to pay tribute to armed insurrectionists who tried to overthrow the duly constituted government led by President Lincoln, or whether we're going to yield to those persons who wanted to continue slavery. We have to have what Dr. King would call, we have to have what he would call a come to Jesus moment. And the come to Jesus moment is to really recognize and understand nothing is more central, nothing is more pervasive, nothing is so embedded in our culture 24/7 than the doctrine of what I say, white supremacy. And what do I mean by that? I mean that people don't understand. People don't understand that a large, substantial segment of white people in America, until certain events occur, they don't think about it. You know, being white is like breathing. You know, you're just white. But being black, it has certain existential consequences. And that is
a very good point. If you hold that thought, Dr. Jones.
Yes.
In your book, Mr. Moore, you talk about the case of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, who at age 25 died in the custody of Baltimore police after being arrested for possession of a knife. Tell us how the life and death of Freddie Gray exemplifies racism.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how trauma compounds, how injustice compounds, and how pain compounds. You know, the story of Freddie Gray is a tragic one, and I'll start off with what actually happened the moment when he lost his life, and then I'll also say why the tragedy began long before that. Where one day Freddie Gray, at the time, as you said, was a 25-year-old young man who made eye contact with police. By the way, let's start there. That was his crime, that he made eye contact and ran. Because in certain neighborhoods, those deemed to be high crime neighborhoods, simply making eye contact and running is enough to give an officer probable cause to be able to chase you and arrest you. And that's what happened. That was his crime. He was caught, he was arrested. An hour after he was arrested, he was in a coma. A week after he was placed in a coma, he died. And there was 2 weeks of protests that took place around just demanding justice and demanding accountability and demanding an understanding of what actually happened to Freddie Gray. Despite the fact that just in the 2 years before Freddie Gray, in Baltimore City alone, there was Chris Brown, there was Anthony Anderson, there was Tyrone West, other people, other young African American men who all met the same fate with similar circumstances. And so there were these protests that took place around, and then until eventually one day at 7 o'clock in the morning, Freddie Gray died. A few days later, his body was laid to rest. The funeral took place that morning. And by the time the sun went down that night, the city of Baltimore was in the middle of a state of emergency, and the National Guard was called in. And one of some of the most heartbreaking things about it was not just his death. It wasn't just about what happened and how he ended up ending up in a coma, how he got arrested, and then very soon after being arrested, he had 3 broken vertebrae and a crushed larynx. And there was no explanation for how that happened. But in addition to that, it was also about the fact that maybe the most peaceful week of his life was the week he was in a coma. Because at least that week he was surrounded by doctors and nurses and lawyers and activists and people who knew his name, people who fought for him.
You talked about how as an infant, starting at birth, he was doomed in a sense. Could you explain that, please?
Absolutely, and people who genuinely cared whether he lived or died, because you're absolutely right. This was a young man who was born premature, underweight, and addicted to heroin. His mother battled addiction for much of her life. She never made it to high school, and she lived in poverty her entire life. She gave birth to Freddie and Frederica, his twin sister. And when they finally gained enough weight that they were able to leave the hospital, they moved into a home in North Carey Street, which is over in West Baltimore. That home, along with over 400 other homes in 2009, were named in a civil lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead inside of their home. We have known for over a century that lead is a neurotoxin. We've known this for over a century. The CDC, in fact, indicates that if you have 5 microbes of lead in every deciliter of blood, that you will have cognitive challenges and cognitive difficulties for your entire life. Right? Freddie Gray had 36. And so here was a young man who was born premature, underweight, addicted to heroin, lead poisoned. And by the way, at that time in Freddie's life, he's 2 years old. And so it goes back to the question of what chance did he have in the first place? And as we're talking about ways to be able to deal with these issues, when we're talking about, your really important and brilliant question earlier of, well, what does race have to do with that? The answer is everything. Because it's impossible to understand the structures that we have in place without understanding the role that race plays. It's impossible to talk about the life of Freddie Gray without understanding that Freddie Gray was raised in Baltimore City, which was the birthplace of redlining. A place where literally they looked at the map and decided who could live where dependent on race. And the reason it's called red lines is actually there were red lines made on the map as to where people could actually live. And Freddie Gray happened to live in one of those areas that were redlined. It goes back into the schools that he attended. It goes back into the job opportunities that were available. It goes back to the fact that this was also a place of severe and distinct discriminatory lending, discriminatory housing policies, where the GI Bill was not evenly distributed. This goes back to a place that even when you look at policing, after everything that happened to Freddie Gray, the Baltimore City Police Department was placed under consent decree because of patterns and practices of racial inequality that the police department were putting on these individualized communities. And so we saw how the role that race played and the separation and the inequality that showed itself in so many different ways, that when you had a child named Freddie Gray who was born into the world, and when 25 years later he's taken.
Let me bring Dr. Jones in at that point. During the civil rights struggles of the 60s, there was the Civil Rights Act itself, and then there was the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. And yet, they didn't seem to achieve what people of goodwill wanted them to achieve. What happened?
Well, they achieved each, the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, monumental, tried to rectify the deficiencies of earlier Reconstruction I talked about. And of course, the 1965 Voting Rights Bill is to give new life and breath to the 15th Amendment. In the 1968 Bill in Housing was to end discrimination in housing, but we can't, the eloquent descriptive detail that Westmore provides about Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray is but a case study, a case study of race in America. That's it is. Freddie Gray as a case study has been replicated 24/7, 365 days a week in our country, because we are still grappling with this thing that's got infected our system. We can't get rid of it. It's like some kind of internal amoeba that's affected the whole American body politic. And until we deal with it. So what is that thing I'm talking about? I'm talking about racism. So where does racism come from? Racism comes from a culture and a mindset enshrined in legislation, enshrined in media, that continues to perpetuate the myth that if a person is white, they're better, they're good. If the person is black, they're less good at being white. And this is the issue. And that issue, of course, you have young men going into the police departments in the various states, and they are infected by this virus. Their culture has led them to believe that a black person, just generically, that they encounter deep in their mindset is something less than a white person. That's on the best case basis. On the worst case basis, they have active animosity. So, as I've said in some discussions, America is at what Dr. King and several would call a come to Jesus moment. America has got to face the issue once and for all. Are we going to get rid of this monkey, this thing that's infected and impacts all of our thinking? Are we going to address this? It's not about. I hear people will close down the police, get rid of the police. I don't want to get rid of the police. I want to keep the police. Okay, I want to manage their budget. The African American community, we need the police. I'm not anti-police. I'm anti-racist-based actions of the police. If any community needs effective non-racial enforcement, it's the Black community. So I'm for those people who are calling for more and more management control over the resources and organization of the police department. But I don't want to be, I want to go on record as I'm not opposed to the police. I'm opposed to racist-based police institutions.
If I could jump in
needed
at that point,
in our community.
Dr. Jones, many of the people watching this webinar live in a beautiful rural area of Virginia. I expect they're mostly white, mostly middle to upper middle income, mostly pretty conservative. I also think and hope they mostly want to do the right thing. We have a question from one of the viewers, and it was specifically addressed to Wes Moore. The questioner asks, what would you say to someone who hasn't seen racism or questions the existence of racism? Someone who doesn't understand or questions the notion of white privilege?
Yeah. It's a beautiful and an important question. And you know, it's interesting because I think that's one of the things that's actually happened during this moment, where we're finding more and more people, because things are caught on video, or because we have things that are running on loops because of media or social media, or simply because the data is very clear about where things lie, that the idea of ignoring that this is real becomes more and more difficult. And I think that it really becomes the first step of all of this, is that an acknowledgement that this is not hyperbole. It's not making stuff up. It's not exaggeration. That understanding that the data is the data, as we've, some of the things that I, spoke about before, but also just the fact that a Black woman with breast cancer has a 42% higher probability of dying than a white woman with breast cancer. The fact that COVID-19 did have a double the impact on communities of color. I mean, this is just data. And so I think it's important to first go through a process of recognizing that the concerns about it, that the pleas around it are real and understandable, and also are justified. I think the other thing that I want people to know is that we walk into these conversations not with an attempt to play gotcha, not with an attempt to prove people wrong or anything along those lines. We do it because we believe in the promise of this country, and the promise of this country, the thing that this country was built on, was an idea and an ideal that our country has not yet achieved. But it was an idea and an ideal that everybody had an opportunity to be able to move, maneuver, persist, and push forward. And I think the third piece is that what we are looking for in terms of our society should actually be something where, when people say, for example, when people say to me, well, I don't see race. I want people to know what I hear when you say that. Because what I hear is, it's you telling me I don't see your Blackness, as if there's something inherently wrong with that. I actually don't want us to think or even to strive to be in this idea of a post-racial America. I want us to be in a post-racist America. And in a place where we know that each and every one of us has had our very important and concrete role in building this nation. And therefore, all of us should feel a sense of pride in this nation. All of us should feel a sense of pride and a sense of ownership as to what we hope for the future of this nation. But it also means being able to look at the context of what's been created, the context of the fact that we do not have equal policing in every neighborhood, and we definitely don't have equal accountability for those officers. We definitely do not have equal educational opportunities, or job placement opportunities, or health outcomes. And those things are not by accident, and they're also not simply because one group has worked harder. The fact that we have a 10-to-1 wealth gap between the average white family and the average African-American family is not because the white family worked 10 times harder. There's systems that allowed for that gap to be what that gap is. And so the thing that I would ask for all of my friends is for us to don't let the data scream at us. Don't let these both quantitative and qualitative examples stare us in the face and us not have any response. Our job in this moment is to be able to understand that these things are real. And then to truly ask ourselves, what unique capacity do we have to be able to address this, to unearth it, to acknowledge it, and to make it no longer so. And that's where this idea of collective and unified improvement is something that actually can become real.
We spoke at the outset about people of goodwill seeming to try to finally come to grips with this problem. Dr. Jones, I saw one of your colleagues in the civil rights movement of the 60s quoted in the newspaper recently as saying that the demonstrations we're seeing, that's a problem. The demonstrations aren't a movement. How do we rekindle what you and Dr. King and the other leaders of the civil rights movement did in the 1960s? Can we do that? Should that be replicated? Or how do we move on from here?
Yes, it's important to build upon the extraordinary achievements that took place under the leadership of Dr. King. It's important to build upon those, as we reflected earlier in the reference to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act. But the problem confronting our country, I believe, is that the majority of white America are gripped what I call a kind of colorblind amnesia. I've had students say to me, Professor Jones, I'm really colorblind. Well, I said, if you are, you need to go to see your ophthalmologist. I know what they're trying to say. They say, I don't see color. Well, they do see color. They're trying to say that they don't, by seeing me or anyone else that's not white, they're trying to say to me that does not impact or determine their behavior. But as you look at history, however, is if you just look at the history of the impact of the consequences of the culture of white supremacy coming from the legacy of slavery. And this is going to be something I say provocatively, but I say out of love. I don't say out of accusation. As I look at the history of America, white people collectively, generally, are presumptively presumed to be racist. Wow, how can you say that, Mr. Jones? I'm just saying, if you look at the history of our country, a presumption can be overcome by evidence to the contrary. But as I look at the history of America and where we've come since 1619 and the Civil War and Reconstruction, I still say the jury is out. The jury is out. And until there is substantial evidence to the contrary,
I'm currently
America is presumptively a racist country. Now, what's taking place in these opposition to these police killings, as you're seeing young people out willing to overturn that presumption, willing to say, look, I don't know anything about all this stuff, Mr. Jones, history of slavery. I don't know anything about that. All I know is I'm a white person and I have a sense of decency and morality, and I know this is not right. Well, hold on. That's the kind of soul that Dr. King was trying to reach. That's the kind of soul, somebody grounded in morality and decency.
And how do you sustain that energy that we're seeing right now? How do we keep that moving?
We only keep that moving by actively encouraging it. I mean it. I mean, we can't, I mean, I think it's marvelous what the Path Foundation is doing. And I think that those participants in the geographical area of the Path Foundation who are listening and participating, I applaud them. And I want those who are listening who are white, I don't want them to misinterpret what I said. I want them to understand I am talking about evidence. I am talking about, if I look at all of the evidence over a period of years, I have to look at the condition of the way white people have treated Black people. And so that means that the challenge is really for those people who have said, not in our name, or no justice, no peace. There are a number of white people who appear to be just as outraged as I am. They didn't know Dr. King. They didn't participate, presumably, in a civil rights movement, but with something so deep in their soul of morality and decency and say, this is wrong. But that's what I'm talking about. And that's what I'm hoping is occurring.
I'm currently reading a book I'd recommend to everybody in the white community. It's called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About.
That's a super book. I use it in my course. It's magnificent.
The author says white people tend to think of racism as bad people treating Black people cruelly, and think, well, that's not me. And we have a question from another viewer along those lines that let me put to you. Seeing bad behavior by others toward people of color upsets me. I don't know how to react. I know I can't solve the hate and bad behavior of others, but I don't want Black people to fear me because I'm white. What can I do besides just doing my best and being my best? How can people of goodwill get involved in the movement that we're seeing and channel that energy into real, concrete, and final change?
Let my young patriot, whom I admire so much, Wes Moore, when I heard he had been in the military with a paratrooper, I said, no, that joke, that can't be real. I said, he's got a good publicist. I don't know how he put that off. Okay. Then when I dug deeper, I said, this dude is real. He's no joke. And so I look at you and you don't know this, so you're hearing it from me. But I have admired you with such affection and such admiration. And I admire you, it is precisely because of the generation out of which you come. A person doesn't choose. You made a choice. You made a choice that you loved your country so much and you cared about what we're doing that you didn't have to do what you had to do. You could have chosen to do something else, but no. You wanted to go into the military. You want to go and become a paratrooper. You want to become the best kind of patriot in our country because you believed in America. And I like to think that you believed in America and you believed in Dr. King and you believed in that old crazy guy, Clarence Jones. You believed in what we were trying to do. So I think we all should pay, I'm glad to participate on this, don't misunderstand me. But the person that in my judgment is so special is Wes Moore, because he embodies the very best of what it is to be, now listen to me, to be an American. I didn't say Black American. I said to be an American who happens to be Black.
I would certainly second that. And a question to Mr. Moore, serving in the 82nd Airborne Division, service in Afghanistan. my military experience was that it was the first time, really, my coming from a small town in Pennsylvania, that I was side by side with Black people, and we were all in it together. I was not in Vietnam, I was in Korea. But it was an eye opener for me on how I should treat my fellow citizens, my fellow Americans. And I've always felt that we lost something when we lost that melding pot, is some form of national service, a way that we can improve the connection between the white majority and people of color.
Yes. First, I just want to say I'm speechless by your comments, Mr. Jones. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. So I want to I'll very quickly tackle the second, and I actually want to come back to that first question as well. First, on the idea of national service, my honest answer is absolutely. I believe that doing something bigger than yourself for something bigger than yourself is an important prerequisite for people as they go through the process. Because one thing we also know is that people who are involved in service early will be people who are involved in service often. These are people who oftentimes will make it a lifelong habit. And we want people to have a vested interest
Absolutely.
in our nation, and a vested interest in its future, a vested interest in its presence, and have that sense of ownership. And I think that, in many ways, it goes back to the point that was made earlier about my military service, where, one real aspect of my military service, why it was very important to me, was because of the fact that I had people like Mr. Jones and Dr. King and the names Baldwin and the names Hughes and the names Parks and the names Truth that I knew ran through my legacy, was the fact that I have just as much ownership in this country and its future as anybody else.
Come on now.
That there is not that I'm not anywhere in this country because of someone's benevolence.
Come on now.
Because of a social experiment or because of someone's kindness. Everything that we see here, my ancestors had just as much responsibility, just as much vision and foresight when it comes to what was built. And so my feeling of ownership of this country is not because someone told me to feel it. It's because my ancestry earned it.
Oh, baby, you're trying to make an old man cry, right? That's what you're trying to do, man. No, please don't.
I mean,
most beautiful. Those words. Oh, come on now. Those are so beautiful. Those are so magnificent. I know it's real.
It's real.
I understand that.
And the thing that I would say to people who are, who are saying, well, what can I do? How can I be engaged? First thing, it actually ties back to that, right? It's important for all of us to know the history of this country.
Oh, absolutely.
It's important for all of us to know the contributors to this country. It should not just be me or Dr. Jones or who know the names Baldwin,
right?
Who know the names Du Bois, who know the names Washington, who know the names Garvey. That should be everyone's collective responsibility.
Right.
Because they are as much part of American history and American culture and American lineage as Jefferson, as any other name that we want to throw in there, right? And so it's important for us to know that. I think the second piece is we also have to remove ourselves of the idea that somehow, resist this idea that somehow good deeds are sufficient to lead us out of darkness. Good deeds are not sufficient to lead us out of darkness. We have to go from saying that, well, I'm not racist, as if racism is an act, as if racism is just simply if I don't use the N-word or if I don't have a hood in my house, that therefore I'm not racist. Racism is a system. It's a system that has baked itself in all the other systems that we have in place. And so we have an obligation to go from being not just not racist, but go to being anti-racist, and to actively identify the beliefs and the actions and the policies that are enforcing racial inequities right now and actively working to change them. And so by simply saying, I want to do a good deed, that's important and that's wonderful, but it cannot stop there. We have to be able to attack the systems that continue to perpetuate levels of massive inequity, and then continue to allow this idea or this reasoning or this excusing that, well, it's because this group or this person or this neighborhood or whatever, they're just not working hard enough. We have to know our own history. We have to
That's
know
beautiful.
how
Beautiful.
and that will help us to figure out how we then have to move forward.
Right.
Let me ask Dr. Jones, and a question to you too, Mr. Moore. People who want to sustain this moment, who want to finally achieve something permanent, getting involved with the Institute of Nonviolence and Social Justice, getting involved with the Robin Hood Foundation, talk about the opportunities there for service, for more than just occasional good deeds. Dr. Jones?
Well, let me just say that I am blessed and so honored that over a year ago that the University of San Francisco, together with my colleague Jonathan Greenberg, recognized the power and the importance of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and welcomed us into the university to create the Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice at the university. Jonathan Greenberg, who was not on camera, but who was a beloved colleague of mine and co-founder of the Institute, is also a distinguished scholar, scholar in residence at Stanford University Law School for 30 years. And an extraordinary person who I'm sure will agree with me that we are tasked with carrying forward as best as we can the legacy and ideas of nonviolence, love, and social justice that were proposed and worked on 24/7 by Dr. King. I am fortunate by an accident of history that when I was 29 years old and he was 31, we met in California for the first time in the second week in February. And from that second week in February until April 4th, 7.5 years later, I became his political advisor, personal lawyer, and draft speechwriter. And trust me, I'm not trying to be dramatic or theatrical for whatever that means. But there is not a single day that I do not open my eyes as I'm less than 6 months to becoming 90 years old. There's not a single day that I do not think of Martin Luther King Jr. and what an extraordinary human being he was, and how blessed I was as a 29-year-old young man to have 7.5 years of truly the best years of my life. And I've had some extraordinary things happen to me. I had some extraordinary achievements. I mean, I don't need to, just read my resume, you'll see.
Tell us the story of Dr. King's speech. You wrote the first 11 paragraphs of that, but
7 paragraphs. First 7 paragraphs. Well, I don't want to take that time, but essentially, the March on Washington was Wednesday, August 28, 1963. And we were staying, Dr. King and his wife was staying at the Willard Hotel in a suite there, and I was staying there also. I'd come down on a Monday morning, and I'd been in touch with him while he was there, and there came a time when Tuesday evening, some of his closest advisors got in touch with me because they knew that we both were at the Willard Hotel, and they wanted to be sure that they had a chance to talk to him or talk to me, to be sure that they got their last word in as to what they thought he should say. So we had this meeting with some of his advisors, and that was an interesting time. I don't want to use valuable time. You can read about it in a book which I wrote, Beyond the Dream, the making of the speech that transformed the nation. But specifically on Tuesday evening, while Dr. King was wrestling with what he should say, he had been thinking about this, by the way, long before August 28th. Been thinking about it in July and late June, when he knew that the March on Washington was going to take place. So now the moment had arrived, and he was considering what he should say. And having worked with him for a period of time, and I could see that he was wrestling with different ideas, I did something which I had done and often times, frequently in typed form, but more frequently also in handwritten form. I would write out for him some suggestions of text of how we might suggested how we might consider opening a speech, of what is his point of departure, of some of the things he should say. And I wrote that down on a yellow sheet of paper and gave it to him. But that was not unusual. I did that frequently. What was unusual is I didn't know until I actually heard him speak. And I'm listening to him speak, and I said, oh my God. I said, he must have really been tired. Because I said to somebody out there, standing next to me, I can't even remember who it was. I said, this man is about ready to preach. And so for historical purposes, the first 7 paragraphs.
And then Mahalia Jackson, wasn't it, said, tell him about the dream?
That's right. Oh, no, yeah, that was later on, Mahalia Jackson. But the first 7 paragraphs is when I said, we are gathered here today at the foot of the great emancipator.
Let me interrupt. If I may interrupt at that point, Dr. Jones, I know that Wes Moore has another commitment, and I'm going to have to let him go. But before you do, Mr. Moore,
I just want to keep listening to these stories. I am so blown away right now.
So Wes Moore, I will send you. If you don't have my book, don't go waste your time about it. I'll send you a book which details some of that. And the only thing is that, brother, you and I have to meet.
Amen.
But it was extemporaneous, wasn't it?
You and I have to meet.
The final part of the speech, the absolute poetry, that was all
extemporaneous.
Extemporaneous.
That is correct. That is correct. A lot of people don't know that.
And Mr. Moore, before you go, let me ask how people who want to get involved with your organization, Robin Hood, how they can get in touch, what they can do, what opportunities there are.
Yeah, so thank you. And you know, Robin Hood is a 32-year-old organization, and really started off in 1988, when there was about to be what our founders had always thought there was going to be a major financial crisis. And these were people who were involved in the markets. And they said, we think this is going to be a really hard year for the markets, but who we think it's really going to be hard for is for people who are already living in poverty. Because I think as we've seen now, even when you look at the impacts of COVID-19, this thing hits those who are most vulnerable oftentimes first and hardest. And they started this foundation called Robin Hood, where Robin Hood said, okay, well, we want to put capital, and we want to, and they said, we're all data people. So we want to use data to find who are the most effective organizations, who are the ones that we can give quantifiable evidence of their impact. And we want to find them, we want to fund them, we want to build them if necessary. And now, 32 years later, we support over 300 organizations every single year. We've allocated north of $3 billion into the poverty fight. And we put capital and expertise and management assistance into every asset. Or I say wherever poverty is either the cause or the consequence, we will find it. So education, housing, transportation, mental health, physical health, criminal justice reform.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
What is, a question both for you and Dr. Jones, what's the one question that you wish your white friends would ask you and never do?
Say that again?
What is the one question you wish your white friends would ask and never do?
Question.
What can I do, Clarence, that's going to make America better? That's the question I want to hear.
Mr. Moore?
I actually think for me, it actually wouldn't even be so much a question, it'd be more of a statement. And I think the answer is I'm willing to let others lead as well. I think about some of the biggest challenges, I think about, for example, in our work in philanthropy, where we know the percentage of the population that we are serving that are people of color. I also know that around 10% of all philanthropic dollars go to organizations led by people of color. That oftentimes there's this understanding and there's this belief that solutions have to be found for people. Without also, and by underappreciating the fact that sometimes the people who are closest to the challenges are going to be the ones who are closest to the solutions.
Come on now.
And I want people to know that when we're talking about growth and empowerment, it means sharing power. It means autonomy. It means flexibility. And it means being okay with that. Because if your goal is really to move us to a better place, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the one to lead us there. If
What's more?
Moving to a better place, it means we have to be able to share power.
Mr. Moore, I have renamed you. I've renamed you as a paratrooper preacher. You got it now. I just named you the paratrooper preacher.
Dr. Jones, I will take it. That is an honor coming from you. I will take it.
No, I'm looking at you and I say, oh my God, look at this young man. You're a paratrooper preacher. You got it, brother.
God bless you.
I want to thank you very much, Wes Moore. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Clarence Jones. And I want to thank each of our viewers, the people looking in on this broadcast, for taking the time to learn more about these issues. And I hope out of this hour that there will become a renewed commitment on the part of my fellow white people, Black people, to make this what we all are united in wanting it to be, which is the nation that Langston Hughes said, the country that never has been yet. And so thanks again. I think this has been an educational evening for our viewers, and I appreciate both of you taking the time to join us. Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.